Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Chaplain York's first autumn Philanthropy Briefing. These are been a really interesting opportunity for us to bring clients and other charities to the notice of people in a way that means that they can actually talk freely about what they do and the issues that they're facing on a regular basis. And by putting three together, it means that we can sort of dig deeper into what's really going on in their particular charitable activities. I mean, they've just been amazing. We've just been agog at some of the really exciting stuff that's going on and that just doesn't kind of come across sometimes in the press, which seems to focus on the spectacular things, but not often the really back issues that these wonderful charities address. Today we're looking at animals, and we've got three amazing charities to talk about. The rules are there's no pitching going on. This isn't a fundraising opportunity. This is purely a learning experience. They do not have and will not have details of who's attending, but obviously if you want to reach out to them, fantastic. But this is absolutely not what this is all about. So what I'm going to do is introduce our first speakers. We'll have about 15 minutes each, and then if there's any questions at the end, feel free to ask them. I mean, if something comes up instantly, obviously let us know. There's also the chat section, which if you want to raise something, please do, and we'll ask it for you. But what I'll do is I'll introduce the first charity, and then after they've spoken, come up with the second and then the third. So the first charity that's going to speak is Elephant Protection Initiative, and John Scanlon and Greta Flory are going to be are introducing that and then speaking for a few minutes. So John and Greta, away you go.
Thank you very much, Nancy, and a big thank you to Chaplain York for the invitation to join you this morning. And it's great to see colleagues from fellow charities all online together. John Scanlon's my name. I'm the CEO of the Elephant Protection Initiative Foundation. And the Elephant Protection Initiative is an initiative of 21 African states who are committed to doing all they can to protect their elephant populations. And I'm joined today by two colleagues, Greta Flory. Greta is our Director of Program Development. She has been leading our work in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa for some time, but more recently she's picked up our overarching priority going forward, and that is she is the team leader of our human-elephant conflict team. She's just brought that team together and completed a really compelling strategy on human-elephant conflict, a path to harmonious coexistence. We've just released it yesterday in English, French, and Portuguese. Greta's going to talk about the EPI more generally and the work of the foundation, but with a specific focus on the human elephant conflict strategy. We're also joined by our good friend, Dr. Winnie Kiru. Winnie's joining us from Kenya. She's our Director of Government Relations. Great to have Winnie with us as well. But with that, I'm going to hand to my good friend and colleague, Greta, to take you through the EPI and with a particular focus on what we're doing to address human-elephant conflict. Greta.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the whole Chaplain York team, Nancy and Anna, for inviting us today to share a little bit about our work. And for those who don't know us, the Elephant Protection Initiative is a Pan-African alliance of 21 member states working to protect Africa's elephants. We work to close ivory markets, as well as more recently, as John has mentioned, we focus on the incredibly complex realities of trying to mitigate and reduce human-elephant conflict. The EPI Foundation, which all of us on this call today belong to, is part of the Secretariat to the Elephant Protection Initiative. The EPI was launched by the leaders of Botswana, Chad, Ethiopia, Gabon, and Tanzania during the London Conference on Illegal Wildlife Trade in February 2014, with the support of the British government. And together with a lot of our local partners and NGOs, the EPI has garnered vast support from current as well as former heads of state, and has become one of the most prominent African-led institutions working to find solutions and creating a world that is just both for people and our land's largest mammal, the elephant. Our leadership council, as seen over here, is an impressive member list with a vital component to supporting the EPI's ability to convene high-level government, thought leaders, and influential figures across Africa in this space. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, which was on the Leadership Council until 2020, had to leave, unfortunately, due to his commitments to the GEF, but is really a testament to the impact that is being achieved by the EPI. The goals of the EPI have always been, as on your screen, maintaining the international ban on the ivory trade, closing down domestic ivory markets, putting ivory stockpiles beyond economic use, and implementing the African Elephant Action Plan. These will always be very fundamental pillars of the work that we do, but if we want to secure the future of Africa's elephants, we have understood that we must do much more. So last year, during the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, we started to look beyond ivory. And with John's support, we developed EPI's and the Foundation's Vision 2030. It really is looking across the horizon to 2030, 2050, the next century. It is really our rapid economic and infrastructural growth, increasing natural resource competition, boundless consumption, climate change, and now the impacts of COVID-19 that we recognize are going to be the largest threats to elephants across the continent at large. And I want to share a film in the next slide by our very own Dr. Winnie Kiru to show and highlight a little bit of the challenge more brilliantly.
My name is Winnie Kiru. I work for the Elephant Protection Initiative. This is an African initiative that looks at ways of protecting elephants while creating sustainable livelihoods for the people of Africa. They lost their son. He was trampled by an elephant.
Ore enewueji hasara sapuk oleng amu ore enkerai ino miyiolo, ore enkerai ebulu nimiyiolo naa kebaiki nelotu aas entoki sapuk zaidi kake mee iyiok, ore iltung'anak otusuja pookin mee iyiok ake etusuja ata sirkali.
The Elephant Protection Initiative is now looking for innovative ways to deal with human-elephant conflict, sustainable livelihoods for the people, and indeed a future for elephants across Africa.
So as we've just seen in that compelling video by Winnie and the Amboseli communities, human-elephant conflict and broader human-wildlife conflict is tremendously complex. It's very site-specific and it's constantly changing. It challenges everything we know about conservation, protected area systems, and development at large. And that is why we decided to develop a human-elephant conflict strategy, which really just provides us a starting point. It is by no means the end goal, and I personally believe it is a dynamic, ever-evolving document which will help us tackle not only the site level and grassroots realities, but as much the landscape level and governance shifts that are needed to make tackling this incredibly complicated issue a little bit more digestible. As you can see on your screen, our vision is to enable harmonious coexistence of people and elephants with herds able to travel across their range, thereby protecting a diverse range of wild animals and plants, combating climate change, and supporting local livelihoods. Next slide, please. To deliver our HEC ambition, and over the next 10 years, really, we want to focus on 3 interconnected strategic priorities: fostering high-level dialogue, enabling local solutions, and amplifying the African voices. And I will get into these a little bit more deeply now. The first one is really fostering high-level dialogue, which is what the EPI is all about. We work to serve the heads of state of the nations that are member countries, and we want to encourage understanding the nuance and complexities through engaging these decision makers, helping influence and rethink policies that have implications on land use, as well as the intersection of land rights and wildlife rights, protected areas, development, and really the cross-sectoral natural resource management thinking that we need. Often the people who are making the decisions at the very top have never had the chance to see the reality on the ground. And moving on, human-elephant conflict is historically known to have occurred for a very long time across the Asian elephant ranges. And we believe that there's a lot to be learned in this, the mistakes to be avoided, and as well as the best practices and indigenous knowledge Asian leaders, communities, and experts have been dealing with for a lot longer than we have in Africa. We want to help bridge the 2 continents together to provide and really find solutions for elephants and for people, while garnering support and commitment from all of the stakeholders across these 3 levels. The second is really very important as well. enabling local solutions is really at the heart of buying us time. We need to find specific assessments and evaluations on how to support communities on the ground, those that face the brunt of the issue. And by developing an effective and inclusive relationship with government authorities, we want to help build the capacity of human-elephant conflict focal points within the wildlife authorities that are mandated to deal with this issue. At the end of the day, no matter how much we want to be involved, it is the people that live alongside these elephants that are going to have to be implementing the solutions that are found. And finally, we're also looking at how technology and monitoring and managing these systems can come into play. How can we make it better? How can we help African governments across ranges use one standard system that is going to make lasting change in this challenge? And finally, amplifying African voices. This pillar is very, very special, and I think it's very important to me because I believe that by encouraging the voices and the exposure and representation of the diversity of Africans across the continent, we will shift the narrative of HEC across Africa, and we will be able to focus on the challenges by those who are facing the brunt of the issue. We believe that storytelling can change the world. It can change history, and stories allow audiences to connect both on an intellectual and emotional level to the challenges that are being faced, and most importantly, the solutions being proposed to make a difference. And at DPI and the EPIF, we believe that we want to be a forefront runner to bring the HEC issue to the international conservation agenda. And just like many of us, we have all been online through the pandemic and bringing the stories of our work, of our passion, to the world online. And the next big event that we're hosting is going to be on Tuesday, the 21st of September. It is a virtual high-level special event on Africa's wildlife crisis. It will show a screening from a place in Ethiopia that is very special to me because Ethiopia as a range is not known as an elephant range, as a wildlife area. And we want to be platforming the voices of the people on the front lines and then discussing it with the relevant and esteemed decision makers that will be on the panel with us that day. It will be broadcast live in English, French, and Portuguese. And I will put a registration link in the chat box below for anyone that is interested to join us. And we really hope to see you there. Thank you so much for listening. And if anyone has any questions to me, to John, or to Winnie, please go ahead and ask us.
Thank you so much, Greta. That's so interesting the way you've been working and what you're bringing together so many important voices to deal with this problem. And I think that's a very interesting segue as well into our next speaker from Space for Giants, Stuart Slabot, because Space for Giant has also worked very collaboratively in Africa and with African leaders in terms of working for its mission to deal with a whole range of animals. So Stuart, can I turn the floor over to you to tell us more about Space for Giants?
Yeah, certainly. Morning, Nancy, and morning to the rest of the team. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Yeah, I love the topic of today. You know, this whole nexus and this conflict between humans and wildlife, and you know how it comes together is very much where we focused. So, as a brief introduction, Space for Giants is a charity organization, a conservation NGO. We work across Africa. Currently, we have active projects in 11 countries across Africa. And, you know, just over the last couple of years, we've really been reflecting on this. And, you know, the typical approach of conservation NGOs such as ourselves is we work hard to secure a specific landscape and a specific project, and we build a team on the ground and we flesh it out from there. However, we've taken a step out of that and had a look at this problem. You know, it's illegal wildlife trade, all the pressures on conservation, as we all know, you know, they're profound and they're very complex. And we've had a look at this and we've decided that we want to get really involved with the entire value chain that surrounds this. And the way that we do that is, number one, is we realize the premise that we work from is we realize that we need community engagement and community support. And the only way that you can do that is by creating true value. So conservation needs to contribute a value. And we need to be mindful that we don't cut off access to value like resources through our conservation efforts. You know, so that's the one, and I'll explain how we do that in a second. The other one is we realize on the other end of the chain, of the value chain, that we need governmental support, and we do that through building a wildlife economy. So the kind of approach that we've taken over the last couple of years is we use a forum that we created called the Giants Club. And what we do is we bring African presidents into the room. We get them to sign a conservation charter. So each of the countries that we work in, we ask the presidents to join the Giants Club. And what that does is it gives us a seat at the decision-making table. And it gets the presidents engaged in really thinking about their conservation estate and how to do it slightly differently. Immediately once we get that high-level political support, we drop that one notch down into the practical, and we sign a contract with a protected area authority in each country. And then what that does is, remaining with that theme of being at the forefront of decision making, or at least at the table, that contract with a protected area authority gives us access to an entire country's protected area portfolio. And what we do there is we work essentially at three levels. One is at a national policy and regulatory level, where we really look at structural reform, policy reform, regulatory reform. Many of these protected area authorities don't truly understand their own wildlife acts or their regulatory environment surrounding conservation. So we really work hard at building capacity, training, and really making the protected area authorities a more efficient functioning ecosystem and environment. And through doing that, we create a conducive environment for investment and engagement with the private sector, because ultimately we believe that conservation's true success lies in PPPs, or public-private partnerships with government. So not outsourcing from government, but actually moving alongside government and really participative partnerships with the government. So we really work hard at that level. That then drops down into what we call a national level strategy. So for each of the countries, we have a unique national strategy that we look at across the entire network to identify what are the key challenges that they are dealing with in that country. Is it a human-wildlife conflict? Is it community development? Is it funding or financing? Is it capacity? Whatever that is on a national level, we identify the key risks as well as the key opportunities and see how we can mitigate risks and maximize those opportunities. And then finally, the last level that we engage with is what we call a landscape level. This is where community come back into the value chain. But on a landscape level, once we've identified from the national strategy, what are the key areas we need to engage with, we then drop down into specific landscape opportunities where we get involved, and their community is crucial. The historic approach in conservation is that conservation is at the focus. You sort that out first, and then you have a community engagement afterwards. We want to flip that around and say we want to engage with the people first, the citizens of the areas that live in and around these protected areas. And through that engagement with community and creating value there, we want to have a conservation outcome. So it's a slightly different nuance on looking at that. So our community programs are really involved where we get the engagement structure right. We create value through enterprise development, ownership, participation in conservation, in the decision making, and a whole host of interventions that we have there. So those are the kind of three levels how we approach this. What we've also realized is that cross-cutting within that strategy are a couple of thematic areas where we really spend a lot of time in, and the whole illegal wildlife trade is one of them. And to address the illegal wildlife trade, we've taken a very practical approach. The way that we do that is we work on that landscape level, and we train crime scene investigators, evidence management, right through to prosecutorial training in that whole value chain, appropriate sentencing, etc., human rights, all those kind of things. So we look at the entire value chain of what we call the wildlife justice and rule of law in each of the countries, help all the authorities and decision makers across that value chain fully understand what they're dealing with. We write practical training guides and resource guides to help them along that way. And in doing that, we hopefully are sharing up and mitigating the kind of holes that are in the value chain that are actually enabling illegal wildlife trade to continue. So that's the one. Very similar to EPI, what we also do is we address human-wildlife conflict, which is a key issue. The more successful you are with your conservation efforts, unfortunately, the more conflicts you are going to have with your human populations living in and around those areas. So it's really about how do we create coexistence? And there's a number of ways in which to do that, across all three of those levels that we engage at. So human-wildlife conflict or human-wildlife coexistence is another key theme. And then crucial for us, the last pillar that we really look at these cross-cutting ones is what we call conservation investment. It is really where and how do we get innovative funding, not just relying on philanthropic donations into the conservation estate, but how do we get this innovative funding mechanism to be active? Practical ways of doing that is we have a large carbon team looking at developing carbon projects on each of our protected areas estates. That produces carbon credits that we sell for annuity income. The other is the whole green finance world, so bonds, debt for nature swaps, all of those types of things. So we're looking at really fleshing that out. And tourism investment, despite the COVID pandemic, we are starting to see that that's starting to recover slowly. So in many of the countries, Gabon is a really good example. They've had a really good vision for tourism investment around gorilla products and all beautiful wildlife that they have. But for the last 10 years, that's really not shifted. So the way that we look at it is to identify what are the barriers to entry for something like that, and how do we create tourism investment? So what we did is over the last 2 years in Gabon, we've worked as an example, but we do this in all our countries, but we've worked at creating investment incentives for new tourism investors, develop concession agreements that are conducive for private sector partnerships, created an investment-ready climate, created one-stop shop so that you can register a business in that country instead of over 2 or 3 years. You can now do it in 2 or 3 weeks. So those are just typical examples of where we climb out of the typical conservation box and we say, all right, if we want a conservation outcome, how do we need to work with people better? How do we need to work with governments better? And how do we need to work with private sector better? And then what happens is we become a honest broker between all those parties to try and share up the holes in the system and create those opportunities. So Nancy, I want to hand back to you at that level. Hopefully that gives everybody a bit of an introduction of how we're addressing this whole issue of where humans and conservation meet.
Thank you very much, Stuart. It's very interesting that the way you've looked at how to deal with this particular issue, and I'm really excited at the very end of this to be able to sort of bring you all together, because you're all dealing with such similar kinds of issues, but looking at them in the creativity that people are dealing with to look at how to both fund and also to provide programs to solve this incredibly difficult issue is so exciting and so really inspiring as well. So I want to bring in our last speaker, who's Richard Vine from Ol Pejeta Conservancy, and they sort of look at this slightly differently because they've got a big conservancy area. They have wild rhinos on their land that they're conserving. Richard, can you join us and talk a little bit about what you all are trying to do?
I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Ol Pejeta Conservancy, which I've been here for close on 24 years. Our raison d'etre, our reason to be, is really about rhinos. So we started this conservancy. We actually started it in 2005, but prior to that, we had a population of black rhinos, a small one, around about 40, I think it was. When I first got here, it was around about 20. We then put together a consortium to buy a place called Ol Pejeta Ranch, and we expanded the area available for black rhinos by about 200%. And we now sit across about 110,000 acres of land, and we have managed to grow our rhino population to the point that we are the biggest single black rhino with a total population of around about 146 or 47, I can't remember exactly. The interesting part of rhino conservation in Kenya, anyway, is that actually the country's been very successful at recovering its black rhino population since the low of the mid-80s, where there were probably only about 300 to 350 left in the whole country. They're now just short of 1,000, and a lot of it has been pushed forward in terms of population growth by the private sector, working very, very closely with the national parks under the umbrella of the National Black Rhino Management Plan. But the biggest impediment to further growth is not really poaching. Poaching clearly is an issue, but it's much more around the lack of available secured space into which rhinos expanding rhino populations can move. So if you look at that graph on my presentation, you'll see that our estimated so-called carrying capacity, ecological carrying capacity, is around about 150. At that point, the rate of population growth will start to slow. And clearly, when you're trying to grow a population, that's the last thing you want. And that's because of a lack of space. So finding more space is the biggest challenge in Kenya. And the reason that finding more space is difficult is because of the cost and the risk associated with looking after rhinos. So when we started the El Pejeta Conservancy, and I was interested to listen briefly, albeit, to your previous speakers, but we did not want to replicate the kind of traditional in Kenya conservancy model funded by philanthropists and you know, struggling to work out how it was going to finance the high cost of our ambition, which was to grow our rhino population. So we came up with what we call the integrated model of land use. And what we said was that we were going to challenge a few mindsets. We were going to create a form of land use that should be as productive as possible, not only in terms of its ability to income, and philanthropically to a lesser extent, employ people, grow food, and pay taxes to national government. We felt that if we could do that, we would buy for ourselves not only a kind of social license to exist, but also more political support than simply setting aside land for the preservation of wildlife. So this aimed to, in a nutshell, create a means to support the continued existence of biodiversity, in particular rhinos, at the same time as meeting the economic and social needs of this country, and particularly the people living around us. So we developed a big tourism business. A lot of people have done that, but the fundamental thing that we did that was different from other people was that we decided to integrate our cattle ranching activity. Previously, this had been a cattle ranch with wildlife and with tourism. And there were plenty of people who said that's impossible, but they failed to understand the equation. The equation being is that, of course, there will be compromises on both sides. In other words, if you have cattle with wildlife, of course, cattle will be killed by lions, and of course, there will be competition for forage, and of course, there will be more disease. Similarly, there will be people from a tourism perspective who don't want to come here because they feel that this is not kind of pristine Africa in their imagination from a wildlife perspective. But if you put the two together in the integrated system that we've developed, you end up on a per acre basis producing more money than you would in the either or situation, as well as employing more people and ultimately paying more tax. So we've shown that this can work. And what's important is ecologically, we've also shown that this can work. In other words, we can use the cattle for ecological benefit, but more importantly, we can grow the biggest herd of black rhinos in East and Central Africa, and we have some of the highest population of predators and other wildlife across equivalent land in this part of the world. We're a not-for-profit organization, so with all of that work going on, all of our kind of emphasis on commercial revenue streams as well as philanthropic revenue streams, the aim is to make a surplus, which is the cash pot at the bottom, which then, by virtue of our not-for-profit, gets redistributed back into conservation, but also very importantly back into what we call development, community development work, working together with local government. So, of course, we've had challenges in the system. 2019, if you look at these pie charts, shows that a large percentage of our business was tourism. 59% of our revenue, which is about $12 million a year, came from tourism. The rest was from livestock and agriculture. And we also have got more and more involved in fundraising, not as a means to an end, but as a means to supplement our overall incomes. And 2020 has clearly challenged that with the onset of COVID, to the point that tourism has disappeared. We've had to really sweat livestock and agriculture, and we've had to get much more involved in fundraising. But for me, this is actually not a bad thing, because what it means is that when tourism comes back, we're going to be in a much better position than we were prior to 2019, with more revenue streams and a more robust fundraising department than we had before. So let me just go back to rhinos a little bit. Why are they so expensive? And this chart tries to sort of illustrate that, and this will be familiar to most people. Our aim is to continue to grow our black rhino population. In order to do that, we have to address community needs. We have to have the support of people around us. They cannot be negatively interfered with by the fact that we have wildlife on our property. So human-wildlife conflict is an area of huge concentration for us. We have a boundary fence more to keep the rhinos in than anything else. And then we have this integrated system that I've talked about. So actually our cattle herders, our cattle are herded out during the day, act as general security and eyes and ears, making it more difficult for people to get unrestricted access or undetected access onto the conservancy. But this is then where the expense comes in. We have a series of rhino patrols. The aim is to see each and every single rhino once every 2 or 3 days, so you understand the intensity of patrolling effort. Then we have what we call our armed teams, who are the kind of teeth of our security. And of course, all of this is supported by aircraft and tracker dogs. And we estimate with this system that it's costing us in cash terms around about $10,000 per rhino per year. And that's got to be paid for somehow or another. And of course, the more rhinos you have, whilst there are economies of scale, and the more land you're trying to look after and to secure in terms of growing that rhino population, the more money you have to find. So that goes back to this notion of productive land management that we've developed. We believe that there is no reason why conservation land can't be productive, why biodiversity and the maintenance thereof can't be profitable. And that is the way we operate. So we do everything possible to do stuff on our land which doesn't impinge upon our ability to conserve biodiversity, but contributes to our financial sustainability. I've talked about cattle, but we're involved in a solar business. We're involved in a residential housing estate. We're involved in hay production. We're involved in crop production. We do anything we can with a commercial mindset that aims for sustainability. The fundraising side of it is critically important, as I've tried to illustrate with the previous pie charts that I showed you, but that in our view should be seen as supplemental. It shouldn't be seen as the core of the business, because if you're dependent totally upon donors, it means you lose your own ability to determine your future and your own strategic objectives. And that's not something that we would like to do. Neither do we think that it's a good recipe for conservation going forwards. If everybody had to rely on donor money, there wouldn't be enough. And that would naturally restrict the amount of conservation land and conservation space that is available. So very briefly on the cattle side of things, again, I won't go into it too much because we're limited for time, but people always say, how do you keep cattle with wildlife? And the answer is we separate them temporarily. So predators tend to be active at night. If you can keep your cattle active protected at night, then you can keep them away from predators. We developed a system of mobile bomas. Again, this has been replicated in other parts of Africa. We all have slightly different models. What's interesting is we've learned over time that the use of cattle we can use cattle for ecological benefit. So if you look at the middle bottom picture, you can see bare land that is left by cattle being kept overnight in mobile bomas. And what's interesting about those bare areas is they become enriched by the dung and the urine of the cattle over time. The original grass cover is removed, and it always grows back with a species of grass from the genus Cynodon, which is a highly palatable, very nutritious species of grass that you can see the elephant to the left-hand side is feeding on. So we can, over time, replace 2,000 to 3,000 acres of unpalatable system for us works pretty efficiently. Going forwards, I mentioned that we need more land, and the question that obviously arises is how do we find more land? In front of you is a map which shows Olpejita, and I can't illustrate it easily, but there is an area to the north which we refer to as Eland Downs, which is the kind of light green area. Below that is an area of government land which is referred to as the Mutara Conservancy. Now, the Mutara Conservancy belongs to government, and it's part of a ranch, a cattle ranch, that is set aside by government for the production of cattle. And that's the area into which we're trying to expand our rhino population. It would give us capacity for another 30 or 40 black rhinos. Thereafter, we'd like to expand into Eland Downs. But the question that arises is, how do you secure those areas? If I'd gone to government and said, we just want 20,000 acres of your land for rhinos, it would have been politically untenable. The answer would have been, take them to the national parks. If instead I can go to government and say, look, we have an integrated form of land use which allows you to keep your cattle, but also opens up other commercial revenue generating opportunities and allows your land to be managed in a sustainable manner from a social and environmental perspective, that becomes a much easier sell. And indeed, that is what has happened. So they've now given us that 20,000 acre piece of land to be able to work with. So that's an example of how the integrated land use reduces the opportunity costs of conservation and actually ends up making more land and more area available for conservation work. And that becomes important when you look at this map, which is the whole of the Laikipia area of Kenya, which is where we're based. The areas in white are those areas which are now practicing this integrated sort of approach to land management. Laikipia is home to the second largest population of elephants in Kenya. It's home to the second biggest population of lions in Kenya. It's got 55% of all of the rhinos in Kenya, and it's a fundamentally important wildlife area in this country. But it's not secured through national parks. It's secured through community and privately owned conservancies, practicing an integrated form of land use which addresses social and economic needs at the same time as maintaining biodiversity in the way that I've tried to describe it. If you try to reserve this as a national park, for example, where all forms of human activity were removed, apart from perhaps a bit of tourism, then it would be politically untenable, and frankly, it could never happen. And that becomes even more important when you look at this map, which is the greater sort of northern landscape of Kenya. Laikipia, and you can see Old Pejeta at the bottom, is at the bottom of the map, and thereafter we enter into what we call the Northern Rangelands Trust Conservancy areas. These are, again, community areas which are increasingly being set aside as conservancies, not just for the preservation of wildlife, but more for their sustainable management for the benefit of both people and wildlife. And that's really the fundamental issue here. And just to note that there are now 163, I think it is, registered community conservancies across Kenya, and the majority of them are practicing, but all of them are practicing this kind of integrated approach that I've talked about. So if you add that to the area set aside in national parks, Kenya is actually reaching somewhere in the region of 23% of its land area set aside for some sort of sustainable environmental management. And again, just very quickly to illustrate the importance of that, these are elephant tracks, the different colors. The elephant in red, this is over, I think, a period of 18 months. I don't really know, it's quite an old map, but the elephant in red is an elephant that was quite well known to us, who used to traverse Laikipia, used to come to Old Pejeta occasionally, but also then he would move on an annual basis all the way northwards to a place called Serra, around about 200 kilometers, spend a bit of time there and come back. The point I'm trying to make is if you want to preserve good numbers of these iconic species, you need space. So the question that arises is, how do you get that space? And as I've said repeatedly, the national park model in the political landscape of Kenya is not the way forward, but the conservancy model that I've tried to describe appears to offer an opportunity for that. And fundamentally, it's all about humans. And I think a previous speaker was making this point. If you don't address the needs of humans, you can forget all of this. And so that's why we have a kind of a community support operation, and it's become quite big. It is primarily supported by philanthropic money. We raise around about $2 million a year, and we spend it on education, we spend it on support to scholarships, we spend it on support to infrastructure in schools, we spend it on health centers, we spend it on a lot of the normal stuff, but inclusive in that is the whole notion that enterprise and economic activity is also important. It's not just about handing sweets over the fence, it's as much about giving people the opportunity to develop themselves from an economic perspective. So this is fundamental. If you can't do this, if humans aren't part of your equation from a conservation perspective, then it's unlikely to work. And very quickly, I hope I haven't taken too much time. I just wanted to make a brief mention of the Northern White Rhinos. Obviously, we've become sort of famous for the attempts to recover this species. We're down to the last 2 females. The only way forward now is in vitro fertilization, which is removing eggs from these females, fertilizing them in vitro, which has to be done in Italy, creating embryos, which will then be implanted at some stage into the future into surrogate southern white rhinos to eventually produce, hopefully, a breeding herd of northern white rhinos, which can be taken back to the wild, probably to the Garamba National Park in the DRC. That's a long shot. It's going to cost a lot of money. There's been quite a lot of controversy about it. Why spend this amount of money, perhaps as much as $10 million to recover one species, which is probably only a subspecies of the Southern White Rhino, when you could be spending that money on a lot of other things. I think that the counter arguments to that revolve around the notion that we have to draw a line in the sand somewhere from a species extinction perspective. And the second argument I would have is that if you look at, in fact, we did a study to estimate the PR value of this effort to save the Northern White Rhino from extinction. And we reckon that the publicity value has, the publicity that's been attracted to the issue of extinction globally as a result of this particular program is somewhere in the region of $600 million. So even if we fail, and even if we succeed and it costs $10 million, these rhinos and this program is acting as a kind of ambassador for extinction. And I think that can only be a good thing. So let me stop there. I hope you heard most of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's been very interesting and very, again, it's brought up issues that I think lots of us have never thought about in terms of how you deal with the community, how you deal with the animals, and the model that you've created. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask all of our charities a couple of questions. The first question I'd like to ask everyone, and maybe Greta and John, you'd like to start, is what would you say your biggest challenge is going forwards?
Okay, yes, thank you so much. And thank you to the other speakers. Those were very interesting presentations. I think the biggest challenge in the work that we're doing with the Elephant Protection Initiative is really the vastness of it. It's very complex. Human-elephant conflict is looking at everything that we can think about. It's not just about wildlife. It's not just about people. It's really about the interface of how do we go forward when the resources that we have in on our planet are diminishing rapidly. Climate change is a huge threat to everything that we know and everything that we do, and that is going to be a huge driver of human-elephant conflict, human-wildlife conflict. Therefore, bringing together the many stakeholders to find their ability to realize that it's all of our responsibility, that we can't work in silos anymore, that we have to engage. And this has been a big challenge of conservation at large. The fact that people have been able to work and live in silos for so long, but that's no longer going to be possible in the current world that we see. We've seen that with the pandemic. You know, for a very long time, the conservation space depended so heavily on wildlife economies, on the dependence of tourism income, and essentially exporting the wildlife experience. And the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that all of a sudden overnight disappeared. And in some states, and especially where I'm from in the Horn of Africa, where wildlife economies have never been developed, it's going to take very long years, if not decades, for that to start up again. So when we go back to leadership and we have to create value for wild spaces and for wildlife and elephants, what do we say? So how can we bring embedded value into the conversation, that it is not just the economic generation that matters, but the fact that our life depends on these systems. Our life depends on the fact that we need to coexist with the natural world, and really driving this home across stakeholders and across levels. So not only at site level, but at high level as well, is going to be crucial going forward.
Can I just ask, have you found it more difficult now, where your fight is to try to explain the need for animal conservation as opposed to human issues that have been addressed over the problems over the pandemic? Is that highlighted of trying to explain why animals are so important?
You know, I think there's been both. There's been the fact that because of the pandemic, obviously the humanitarian issue and the medical and public health issue has taken a forefront in the mind of everyone, of funders, of governments, and rightfully so. That has been the priority. But I also think because the past year we've seen such a crazy shift in the climate, it's affected so many people. It's really made people realize that climate change and the the destruction of nature is no longer something that you can put off or you think it's not going to affect you. And therefore, the conversations that I'm having now with leaders, with conservation individuals, with experts, and also those that don't work in that space have been rooted in the fact that we need to work together, that at the end of the day, all of our existence depends on it. So it's a bit of a balance between the two.
Thank you very much. Stuart, what is Space for Giants? What would you tell us about, sort of the greatest issues that you're facing at the moment, the greatest challenges?
I think for me, that's an easy one. It will most definitely be funding. You can't make it less than that. We've got the political buy-in. We've got these presidents that have signed up. We've got 11 countries we operate in, and we have access to 11 and growing countries' portfolio of protected areas. This is several hundred protected areas that we have access to. We have the clear mandates to do that. Multiple millions of local citizens involved in and around those. Yeah, sure, there's multiple challenges across everything that we do, but the single most important thing for me as a conservation organization is to impress upon the funding flows into the space the importance of securing that. If we have the funding in place to be able to do what we do best, and use the access and the mandates that we have, I think we can fundamentally shift the needle on all of these things: human-wildlife coexistence, illegal wildlife trade, and just making these countries and these protected areas more robust. So it's about finding funding mechanisms that give us the unrestricted access to the cash to do what we do. That would be the single most important thing for me.
Could you just quite briefly just mention your president's kind of club that you've created? It's not your challenge; it's been your success.
Yeah. Look, sometimes it has a flip side to it as well. So what the Giants Club is, it's a forum where we would invite at our discretion a president to join the Giants Club. And what it is it's an opportunity for a president, and the only reason why we would invite them is if they make a very clear and written contractual commitment to conservation in their country. So not all 11 countries where we operate are Giants Club members. We only have 6 at the moment of those 11, and that's very deliberate because we're not convinced yet in some of the others that these presidents and as a political organization or organism that they've actually made those commitments. So the Giants Club is about the president making a written commitment and signing up to a conservation charter. What we then do is outside of that, we then have private membership of high net worth individuals or influential people from the private sector where we can marry, let's call it the money with a political will. And that's what the Giants Club is trying to do, is it's trying to create that opportunity where we can become the honest broker and marry money with political will. And where those two align and where the political commitment is made to conservation in their countries, it's a good match. And then we sign those presidents up.
Richard, same question to you. What would you, leaving aside, I suppose, money, because it's always an issue, what would you say that, looking today when you get off this call, what's the biggest challenge that you're facing?
Obviously, it is money. Money is always the issue. But I think it's a little bit deeper than just money. I think it's all about, well, there's two things. I see in the conservation space a lot of people leaving a lot of money on the table. In some areas, there's been this kind of infatuation with generating the incomes required from philanthropy. And of course, philanthropy is a major contributor. It's massively important, and it will always be really, really important if we want to save these iconic species and these wild areas. But by the same token, I would argue that we cannot ignore other opportunities to make money. We've got to be efficient from a tourism perspective. We've got to be efficient from a land management perspective. And we've got to be innovative in terms of how we use those areas to make the money that is required to preserve them into the long-term future. And that certainly has been a kind of guiding light for us. My second point would be that I think people just have to think out of the box more. This is not, and we talked about it, I think, already this morning, but the traditional approaches to conservation have to change, and they are beginning to change. And my last point would be that it has to become more mainstream. You know, I don't understand, although I think it is changing, why conservation is not the most important business in the world. You know, again, we talked about it earlier, but there's lots of good evidence now to suggest that biodiversity is important for the well-being of people. And we know that ecosystem services such as air, you know, reduced carbon dioxide, good soils, and et cetera, are fundamentally important for the sustainable, sort of enjoyable existence of human beings. So, you know, conservation, however you define conservation, is a massively important important business. Can I put it that way? An important business across the planet, and yet you find that it's underfunded. You find that it's pushed aside for the interests of big corporates and so on and so forth. And somehow that has to change. And I think it is changing, by the way, as climate change begins to get a grip, and the notion of extinction begins to become mainstream. But in order to get that funding, you know, we're going to have to get mainstream, and I think that's really a big challenge for all of us.
If I were to ask you, each of you, starting with what you were just saying, what is the one takeaway you wanted those who've joined us this morning to go away with? Would you say, Richard, your last point, that conservation is actually needs to be mainstream and needs to be crucial in terms of everyone's thoughts? Would you say that would that be your takeaway, or is there something else that you would like to share with people?
No, I think that would probably be my takeaway. But what I would say is, if that's going to happen, it's got to become something that is more accessible and more understood by people. Right now, you know, conservation is something you choose to go and do instead of becoming a banker or whatever. I think what needs to happen in the future is, and this is what I mean by mainstream, the way businesses are run needs to incorporate the needs of the environment as a fundamental part of the way their businesses are run, but also something that is fundamentally important to the success of their businesses. And I do think it is coming. We had some stuff. We did some stuff with a big airline about 3 or 4 years ago, and they had recognized even then that if they didn't change their ways in terms of carbon emissions, that they would cease to have a business in 10 or 15 years, because customers simply wouldn't buy in to the notion of flying on carbon expensive jets around the world. So, you know, this is happening. It is happening slowly, but I think it probably needs to happen faster. It probably needs to happen with more involvement, proactive involvement from government. And yeah, it's making it more accessible. It's making it mainstream. It's making sure that everybody on the planet begins to understand what is required and live their lives accordingly, putting pressure on the corporates where necessary to change, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. It's very inspiring. Stuart, may I ask you the same question? What is the takeaway that you would want people to leave with?
Yeah, certainly. I think building on what Richard said, you know, he's hit the nail on the head on all those aspects. So to make it quick and short, I think to build onto that is to also just impress upon people out there that it's a holistic approach. You know, in terms of what we do, it's no a site-specific within a fence type of conservation. This is a holistic approach. It has lengthy, complex value chains. It needs time, you know, it needs a lot of time. So what we're looking for is we're not looking for, although they're very welcome, any kind of once-off donation, but what we're looking for is we're looking for partners, you know, to build it, to bring it into the mainstream, all the things that Richard said, but to really truly make a difference in Africa, we need commitments for the longer period of time. So we need people to understand the complexity of this and to partner with organizations such as the three on this call, you know, for multiple years, so that we can actually make a difference out there.
Thank you very much. And Greta and John, your last words.
So no, I completely agree. I think for me, I've always viewed the environmental challenges to be social justice challenges, and I think that really recognizing the interplay between our social environmental challenges, the systemic inequality, the armed conflicts, extreme poverty, ethnic divisions, anything that you see on the front lines of wildlife habitats. That is really what we need to work on. We need to amplify that message. We need to recognize the failure of conservation until now to be able to protect what it's meant to do, so the wildlife that it's protecting, but also to restore human rights in the process. And I think, you know, challenging the conservation models for the better, to take into consideration that the world is changing. There's a lot more challenges coming our way, and in order to do this, it means we're going to have to reflect, we're going to have to work together. And we're going to have to be able to say what isn't working needs changing. And as both of the other speakers said, it's not easy. There's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of nuance, but I think that having the platform to have these difficult discussions, both with leaders as well as those that are facing the brunt of the issue, so communities on the ground, is the way forward. And I'm glad that we are having these conversations now.
Thank you very much, and may I thank all of you for coming and for talking, but also I think probably for your passion and your creativity and your intelligence, is that as you and your charities face these issues for us and for the populations that you support. So thank you all very much. Thank you, those of you who have come. I hope you found it interesting, you can't help but find it interesting. And thank you all very much. And we hope you found this morning very interesting. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a very good day.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.